The Forgotten Ancestors of Florida. A historical archaeological. When most people think of Florida, they imagine beaches lined with palms, alligators sliding into swamps, or neon lights in modern cities. But beneath the tourist dream lies a deeper story, one written not in brochures but in the soil itself. Every shell mound that rises along the coast, every fragment of pottery found in the sand, every burial preserved in the wet muck of a pond, tells of a world that existed long before Europeans stepped ashore. This is the story of Florida's first people, the Native Americans who lived, thrived, fought, worshipped, and died in this peninsula for thousands of years. Their lives were shaped by water and sky, by the salt of the Gulf and the endless wetlands of the Everglades. They left behind traces that archaeologists carefully pieced together: shell rings, wooden carvings, pottery, weapons, and bones. These traces speak, if we listen, of cultures as complex and rich as any found in the Americas. The story begins over 12,000 years ago, during the late Ice Age. The Florida of that time was not the Florida we know today. The sea level was lower, the coastline extended far beyond the present, and the peninsula was almost twice its modern size. What is now the Gulf of Mexico's shallow shelf was dry land, stretching into a plain where mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats roamed. Into this landscape came the Paleo-Indians, the earliest known inhabitants of Florida. They were hunters and gatherers, people who followed game and sought water sources. Archaeological sites, such as Page Ladson on the Osceola River, have revealed stone tools lying beside the bones of extinct mastodons, proving that humans were here at least 14,000 years ago. The Paleo-Indians used stone spear points, known today as Clovis points, fluted and sharp. They hunted big animals but also relied on smaller game, fish, and gathered plants. As the climate warmed and the Ice Age giants disappeared, their descendants adapted. They turned increasingly to rivers, lakes, and coastal waters, developing a culture deeply tied to Florida's wetlands. By around 8000 BCE, the Paleo-Indians had given way to what archaeologists call the archaic peoples. These communities witnessed the rising seas that slowly drowned the great coastal plains. As water encroached, Florida shrank to its modern shape. Where mammoths had once walked, dolphins now swam. The archaic peoples adapted brilliantly. They developed new tools, ground stone axes, mortars, and pestles, to process nuts, seeds, and roots. They fished with bone hooks and nets. Archaeological sites such as Windover Pond, near Titusville, give us an extraordinary glimpse into their world. At Windover, a peat bog preserved a cemetery over 7,000 years old. More than 160 skeletons were found, buried with care. Some were wrapped in woven fabric, the oldest known textiles in North America. The bog preserved not only bones, but also brain tissue, revealing diseases and injuries. The burials showed that these people cared for their sick and honored their dead with rituals. The archaic peoples also built the first shell middens, giant piles of oyster and clam shells left behind by generations of feasting. Over time, some of these middens grew into monumental earthworks, shaped into rings and mounds. They were not mere garbage dumps. They were the foundations of villages and ceremonial centers. By the first millennium BCE, Florida's native cultures had entered a new phase. Across North America, this was the age of mound builders, societies that constructed large earthworks for burial, ceremony, and power. Florida was no exception. In the north, the Deptford culture built circular villages along the St. Johns River. Farther west, in the Panhandle, the Weedon Island culture created elaborate burial mounds. Their pottery, decorated with incised and painted designs, stands among the finest in prehistoric North America. The mounds were not only tombs, they were stages upon which societies enacted their beliefs. Leaders were buried with shell ornaments, copper artifacts, and effigy vessels shaped like animals and humans. These grave goods tell us of trade networks that stretched far: copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf. Florida was never isolated. It was part of a web of exchange across the continent. Among the most impressive sites is Crystal River, near today's Gulf Coast. There, A ceremonial complex of mounds, plazas, and causeways flourished for centuries. Pilgrims from across the southeast visited, leaving offerings of pottery, stone, and shell. Archaeologists believe it was a sacred center, a place where the living connected with the dead and with the cosmos. If one culture defines Florida's native past in the public imagination, it is the Calusa. By the time Europeans arrived in the 16th century, the Calusa controlled the southwestern coast, ruling an estuary kingdom that stretched across the Gulf. The Calusa were not farmers. Unlike many tribes who depended on corn, beans, and squash, the Calusa lived almost entirely from the water. They were fisher kings, masters of the estuaries. They built immense networks of canals, fish traps, and artificial islands out of shells. Their capital was at Mound Key in today's Estero Bay, a city of shell mounds rising like pyramids above the mangroves. Spanish explorers marveled at the Calusa's power. They described a paramount chief, or cacique, who ruled over thousands of people and could summon armies of warriors in canoes. The Calusa built ceremonial structures, possibly temples atop their mounds. Inside, wooden carvings, intricate and haunting, were placed as sacred objects. Few survive, but those preserved in the Key Marco site, discovered in the 1890s, are among the greatest treasures of North American archaeology. The Calusa believed in a complex cosmology of three souls and an afterlife journey. They feared the spirits of the dead and honored them through ritual. They resisted Spanish missionization fiercely, rejecting Christianity and clinging to their traditions. For nearly 2 centuries they remained unconquered, until disease and warfare finally eroded their strength in the 18th century. In northern and central Florida lived the Timucua, a group of related chiefdoms who spoke dialects of the same language. When the French established Fort Caroline near modern Jacksonville in 1564, they encountered the Timucua, tall and tattooed, wearing deerskin garments and elaborate body paint. The Timucua practiced agriculture, growing maize, beans, and squash, but they also hunted and fished. They built villages of circular houses around central plazas. Archaeological remains show they constructed mounds for ritual and burial, similar to their neighbors in Georgia. The Timucua greeted the French as allies against the Spanish, but soon became entangled in European rivalries. Jesuit and Franciscan missionaries established missions among them, but epidemics of smallpox, measles, and influenza decimated their numbers. By the 18th century, the Timucua were nearly extinct as a distinct people. Farther west, in the Panhandle, the Appalachee ruled the fertile Red Hills. Their capital near present-day Tallahassee boasted fields of maize that impressed the Spanish. The Appalachee were part of the Mississippian world, building temple mounds and practicing complex ceremonies. They became the backbone of the Spanish mission system in Florida, providing food and labor for St. Augustine. But their loyalty was not eternal. When English raiders and their Creek allies attacked in the early 1700s, the Appalachee were destroyed or dispersed. The arrival of Europeans in Florida, first the Spanish with Juan Ponce de Leon in 1513, then expeditions by Hernando de Soto and others, was catastrophic for the native peoples. Diseases spread faster than armies, killing half or more of the population before direct encounters. Those who survived faced warfare, enslavement, and forced labor. The Spanish established St. Augustine in 1565, the oldest city in the continental United States, and missions soon spread across Florida. Native peoples were drawn into the orbit of empire, their autonomy eroded. Some resisted fiercely, like the Calusa, who killed missionaries and rejected baptism. Others, like the Appalachee, tried to adapt, only to suffer when colonial rivalries brought destruction. By the 1700s, many of Florida's indigenous societies had collapsed, their survivors fleeing west or merging with other groups. Into this vacuum came new peoples, the Creeks from Georgia and Alabama, who migrated into northern Florida. Over time, their descendants, mixed with Africans who escaped slavery and found refuge in the swamps, became known as the Seminoles. The Seminoles carried Florida's native legacy into the modern era, fighting wars against the United States in the 19th century and surviving removal attempts. For centuries, the voices of Florida's first peoples were nearly silenced, but archaeology has become a way to recover their story. Sites like Windover Pond, Key Marco, and Crystal River provide windows into vanished worlds. The wooden carvings of Key Marco, preserved in muck for 1,000 years, reveal the Calusa's artistry and spirituality. The burials of Windover show compassion and ritual among archaic peoples. The mounds of Crystal River and the Appalachee testify to connections that spanned the continent. Even the shell middens that dot the coasts, sometimes bulldozed by developers, are archives of diet, ritual, and daily life. They remind us that what looks like refuse was, for these peoples, the foundation of their existence. Today, little remains of the Calusa, the Timucua, the Appalachee, or the many smaller peoples of Florida. Their languages are gone, their political structures erased, but their presence is not entirely lost. It lingers in the land itself, in the mounds that rise above the rivers, in the canals buried under mangroves, in the artifacts that fill museums. It also lives in the Seminoles and Miccosukee, who, though descendants of later migrations, carry forward the memory of Florida's indigenous spirit. Their resistance, survival, and modern identity are part of the same long story of adaptation to a challenging land. To walk the Florida coast with knowledge of its first peoples is to see differently. The shell mound is no longer a hill, but a monument. The swamp is not empty, but filled with ghosts. The land itself is a text, written over 12,000 years, telling of hunters and fishers, of mounds and ceremonies, of resilience and loss. The story of Florida's Native Americans is not a footnote to history. It is the foundation upon which everything else was built. And though centuries of conquest tried to silence it, archaeology and memory together keep the voices alive. Thanks for watching this video and subscribe for more history and culture.